This is my true story. I had been gone for almost a year, staying with my sister after a long surgery. My family said they would take care of my house while I recovered. I missed them, the sound of my son's laugh, the smell of my home, the warmth of being together again. So one afternoon, I decided to come back early. I didn't tell anyone. I just wanted to walk in, sit on my old chair, and surprise them. But when I opened that door, the laughter inside stopped, because of the man standing behind me. Before I tell you, comment where you're watching from, and please subscribe so my story can reach more people. When I first pushed the door open, the sound of laughter filled the air so strong it almost covered my footsteps. For a moment, I stood there in the entryway, holding my small travel bag, just listening. My son's voice echoed from the living room, mixed with his wife's and my daughter's. They were laughing hard, the kind of laugh that comes from comfort, from feeling at home. It made me smile. After all the long months in a hospital bed and then in my sister's guest room, hearing that joy again felt like medicine. I thought maybe they were watching something funny or celebrating something small. I wanted to join them quietly and make them jump with surprise. I imagined my son turning around, shocked, smiling, saying, "Dad, you're home." I imagined my daughter running up to hug me. That thought made my heart warm for a moment, but as I stepped closer, things started to feel strange. The living room was lit bright. My old lamp was still there, the one I fixed myself years ago. But next to it sat new furniture, a couch I'd never seen, some shiny glass table, and a painting on the wall that I didn't remember buying. On the floor, I saw more shoes than usual. At least 6 pairs. Some looked like men's shoes I didn't recognize. Some high heels. Some muddy sneakers. I stopped there for a second. I thought maybe they had guests, maybe a party, maybe friends over, but it was the middle of the afternoon on a weekday. It didn't fit. When I took one more step forward, my son's wife turned and saw me. Her smile froze like ice. My daughter followed her gaze, and her laughter died mid-breath. My son's face went pale, his hand still holding a drink halfway to his mouth. Nobody said a word. Their eyes weren't just surprised. They looked like they'd seen something they never wanted to see again. I tried to smile, but my lips wouldn't move. Something in their silence told me this wasn't a happy surprise. The TV was on, but the sound felt distant. There was food on the table, half-eaten sandwiches, glasses of wine, and a big cake that said "New Beginnings" in bright red letters. My chest tightened when I read that. New beginnings. What did that mean? I stepped forward slowly, scanning the room, still holding my bag. My son put his glass down carefully like he was afraid to make noise. My daughter-in-law whispered something I couldn't catch. That's when I noticed a shadow behind me, reflected faintly in the glass cabinet. I turned my head slightly and saw the man standing just behind my shoulder, the police officer who'd given me a ride from the bus stop. He was a kind man, maybe in his late 30s. He had offered to help carry my bag when he saw me struggling with my cane. He had even said, "You've got family waiting for you, right? Bet they'll be happy to see you." I nodded back then. I truly believed it. But now, seeing the look on my family's faces, it didn't feel like happiness at all. It felt like fear. The officer stayed quiet, standing still in the doorway. His presence filled the silence. My son's wife looked from me to him, her eyes darting like she was searching for a lie that might work. My daughter held her breath, her eyes red but not from joy. Then, a voice came from the kitchen, a voice I didn't recognize. A man said, "Don't worry, he'll never come back." The words struck me like a brick. He didn't know I was there. The laughter was gone. My family's faces had turned into masks. The stranger in the kitchen stepped into view, holding a mug. He froze mid-step when he saw me. His face went blank, his mouth half open, not knowing what to say. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The officer's eyes hardened. He looked around the room, noticing everything. The boxes by the wall, the cake, the people. And me. I stood in the doorway of my own home, feeling like an unwanted guest. My hands trembled, not from the cane, but from something deeper, disbelief. I tried to speak, but no words came out. I looked at my son, waiting for an explanation. But his lips stayed sealed, and his eyes filled with guilt. That moment stretched forever. Every laugh I had just heard before opening that door now felt cruel. Every echo in that room sounded like mockery. I thought I was coming home to my family, but it felt like I had just walked into a place that had already decided I didn't exist anymore. The man in the kitchen stood there frozen, holding his mug halfway to his mouth. He wasn't young, maybe around 40, wearing a gray sweatshirt and jeans, comfortable like he belonged there. He looked from me to my son, then back at the officer behind me. Nobody spoke. The clock on the wall ticked loud in that silence, like it was counting every heartbeat in the room. My son's wife slowly put her drink down. My daughter stared at the floor. I could feel the air tighten. I didn't even know who the man was. But from the look on his face, he knew exactly who I was. He didn't have to say it. He was the one who had said those words. "Don't worry, he'll never come back." Now, I had come back, and every truth they tried to hide was standing there with me. I tried to stay calm, even though I could feel my chest tightening. I didn't shout. I didn't ask questions. I just stood there, holding the handle of my suitcase, trying to understand how everything had turned into this. The police officer behind me shifted slightly, like he could feel what was coming. My son finally moved his lips, but no sound came out. He looked like a boy again, caught doing something he couldn't explain. My daughter's eyes started to tear up, and she turned her face away. The stranger took a step back toward the counter and put his mug down. His hands were shaking. The officer's voice broke the silence. "Is everything okay here?" It wasn't loud, but it was firm, the kind of voice that expected an honest answer. My son's wife spoke first, stuttering. Yes, officer, we didn't expect him home so soon." Her voice cracked at the end. I could see the officer's eyes scanning the room again. He noticed the boxes stacked against the wall. Some were taped shut, some open, full of things I recognized. My books, my clothes, even the small clock from my bedside table. My eyes followed his. I walked slowly toward the boxes, dragging my bag beside me. I stopped and lifted one of the lids. Inside was my old photo album, the one with my late wife's pictures. It was half buried under folded blankets. My fingers shook as I touched it. I could still smell her perfume faintly on one of the scarves. I looked around again, and that's when I noticed it. My wedding photo, the one that always hung above the fireplace, was gone. In its place was a framed picture of my son, his wife, and the same man from the kitchen, standing together at a beach. Something inside me went cold. I turned to my son. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His wife took a deep breath like she was about to explain something, but the officer raised his hand gently. "Let him process this," he said quietly. I didn't move. I just stood there staring at that photo, my body heavy. I wanted to believe this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe the medicine I'd been taking was making me confused. But then the stranger spoke again, soft this time, almost to himself. He wasn't supposed to come back this soon. That sentence made everything clear. I wasn't part of their life anymore. I was an obstacle, a problem they thought was gone. My house had become their plan. My home had become someone else's comfort. I could feel my knees weaken, but I stayed standing. The officer noticed my face and stepped closer. "Mr. Peterson," he said quietly, "do you want to sit down?" I shook my head. I didn't want to sit. I didn't want to cry. I just wanted to understand how the people I raised had turned my absence into an opportunity. The stranger looked guilty now, but not enough to leave. My son's wife avoided my eyes completely. My daughter finally whispered, "Dad." But her voice broke before she could say more. The officer glanced at her and then at me, waiting. The whole house felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. My home, the place where I spent decades working, saving, fixing every crack and every leak, now looked like a stranger's living room. And that's when I realized the truth wasn't just that someone had moved in. The truth was that my family had already moved on. They had started a new life inside my walls, and I wasn't part of it. Every laugh I heard before stepping in wasn't joy for seeing each other. It was relief that I was gone. And when I came back, that relief turned into panic. The man behind me, the officer, wasn't just a witness. He was the line between what they built and what they tried to erase. The officer behind me stepped fully into the living room now. His shoes made a soft sound against the floor, the kind of sound that made everyone freeze a little more. He looked calm, but I could see his eyes studying everything. The boxes, the strange man in the kitchen, the uneasy faces of my own family. His badge caught the light for a moment, and it felt like the only thing in the room that had any honesty left. He wasn't just there by chance. He was the one who had offered me a ride when he saw me walking alone from the bus stop, carrying my suitcase and my cane. I had told him I was going home after being away for a long time. He had smiled, said it was good to see a man going back to his family, and even helped me lift my bag into the car. I remember he said, "They'll be happy to see you." I had nodded with pride. Now, standing here, I felt his words turn heavy in the air. The officer didn't say much. He just looked around, letting silence speak for him. My son stood up slowly from the couch, rubbing his palms on his jeans like he didn't know where to put his hands. "Dad," he finally said, his voice low, "you weren't supposed to be back yet." It wasn't anger in his tone. It was fear. He looked at his wife, then at the stranger, then back at the officer. His throat moved like he was trying to swallow something heavy. I could tell he was searching for a lie that could make this moment disappear, but nothing came. The officer crossed his arms, standing steady behind me, almost like he was protecting me even though I hadn't asked him to. The man from the kitchen took a slow step forward. "Maybe we should explain," he said, his voice flat. The officer looked at him. "And who are you, sir?" The man hesitated before answering. "Just a friend. I was helping them with some homework." His words stumbled. The officer's eyes narrowed. He didn't press, but everyone in that room knew he didn't believe it. My daughter-in-law spoke next, her voice shaking. "He's been helping us clean up the place. We thought Dad wasn't coming back soon, so we were making space." Her tone was polite, but every word sounded rehearsed. I turned toward my son. He finally looked me in the eyes. I had seen that same look once before, when he was a teenager and broke my truck window, then stood frozen, knowing I'd find out. Back then, he had said, "I'm sorry, Dad." But now, there were no words. Only guilt. Only silence. The officer took a step closer and said softly, "Mr. Peterson, maybe you should sit down." I didn't want to. I didn't feel tired. I felt something colder. The kind of stillness that comes after realizing you've been forgotten in your own life. The officer's hand rested gently on my shoulder, steady and respectful. "You don't have to say anything right now," he said. "You're home. That's what matters." But when he said that, I looked around and realized I didn't recognize this place anymore. The furniture was new, the curtains were different. My wife's photo was gone. My old recliner had been replaced. Even the smell was different. It didn't smell like my home, but like someone else's life layered over mine. My son's wife tried to fill the silence again. "We thought you were happier at Carol's," she said softly. "We didn't want to bother you." Her eyes darted to the officer, then away. The man from the kitchen took another sip from his mug, pretending he wasn't part of this. My daughter's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move closer. The officer straightened up and looked at all of them. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding," he said, calm but clear. "This man still lives here, correct?" Nobody answered. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. The officer took a slow breath, then turned to me. "Mr. Peterson, do you have proof of ownership?" I nodded. My suitcase was still beside me. I bent down, opened it, and pulled out a brown folder I'd kept safe for years. Inside was the deed, my name printed clearly across the top. When I handed it to the officer, he nodded and looked back at them. "Then it's simple," he said quietly. "This man hasn't lost his home." My son's wife's face went pale. My son tried to speak, but the words fell apart in his mouth. The officer didn't raise his voice, but his presence filled the room. He didn't need to say more. The truth was already written in their faces. That moment, I realized something. I didn't need to argue, shout, or ask why. The man standing behind me had already done what I couldn't. He made them see what they had done. I stood there in the middle of that room, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, heavy, full of something I didn't recognize. It wasn't anger yet. It was disbelief. My own house looked unfamiliar. The walls I had painted myself now carried new colors. The photos that once showed my family together were gone, replaced with decorations that had nothing to do with me. My favorite chair, the one I sat in every night reading the newspaper, was missing. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning every corner, hoping maybe I was mistaken. But no, the truth was right there in front of me. Everything that reminded them of me had been erased. I took a few slow steps toward the wall where my wedding photo used to hang. That picture had stayed there for decades. Me and my wife, young and smiling, standing outside this very house the day we moved in. I used to look at it every morning. But now there was a blank space. A faint square outline showed where it used to be. I whispered her name under my breath, feeling my chest tighten. That photo wasn't just missing, it was gone like it never mattered. I turned toward the boxes stacked against the wall. Some had writing on them. Yard sale. Donate. Extra. I bent down and looked closer. Inside one box, I saw my tools, the same ones I used to fix this house when the roof leaked or when the heater broke. Another box had my books, my late wife's blanket, and a few old letters. My hands began to shake. I turned toward my son and asked, "What's all this?" My voice came out rough and dry, like I hadn't spoken in years. Nobody answered. My daughter looked at me for half a second before looking down again. My son's wife pressed her lips tight. The stranger from the kitchen shifted awkwardly, pretending to wipe the counter. Even the officer stayed quiet, watching closely, but letting the silence do the work. I waited. I wanted someone to tell me this was temporary, that maybe they were cleaning or reorganizing, but no one spoke. The longer they stayed silent, the heavier the truth became. Finally, my son rubbed the back of his neck and said, barely loud enough to hear, "Dad, we were just making some changes. We thought—" He stopped himself. His words hung there, unfinished. I didn't ask him to continue. I already knew. My daughter started to cry quietly. She covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking. My daughter-in-law looked away, her face pale. I realized then that guilt has a look, and I was staring at it. I looked around again, my eyes stopping on every small detail. The rug was gone. The curtains were new. Even the smell of the house had changed. It didn't smell like home anymore. No trace of the coffee I used to make every morning. No faint scent of my wife's flowers that once filled this place. It smelled like something else now, like strangers. I reached for the wall to steady myself. The officer moved closer, worried I might fall, but I waved him off. I didn't want help. I wanted to feel the wall. The same wall I had built with my own hands 35 years ago. My palm pressed against it, cold and solid. That was real. Everything else in the room felt fake. The officer finally asked gently, "Mr. Peterson, are you all right?" I nodded slowly, but the truth was, I wasn't. I was holding my home in my hands and realizing I didn't belong in it anymore. The people I raised, the ones I gave everything to, had already started to erase me. It's a strange feeling, to be alive but treated like a memory. As I stood there, I could feel a quiet kind of heartbreak settling in. Not the loud, angry kind. The quiet one that sits in your chest and doesn't leave. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just stood there, listening to the silence that used to be laughter and feeling like the ground under me had shifted forever. That was the moment I understood something I'll never forget. Sometimes, betrayal doesn't start with words or actions. It starts with silence. The kind that tells you everything you need to know. The officer's question hung in the air like a weight. "Do you still have the deed?" And when I nodded, I saw the panic on their faces. It was the first honest thing they showed me since I walked in. My son's wife looked at my son like she wanted him to fix this somehow, but there was nothing left to fix. I reached into my suitcase and took out the brown folder. My hands were shaking, not because I was scared, but because I couldn't believe I needed proof to stand inside my own house. The officer opened it, checked the papers, and nodded quietly. "It's still in your name, sir." He looked around at them. "Everything here belongs to him." That sentence hit them harder than I ever could have. My daughter's eyes filled with tears. "Dad," she whispered, "we thought you were moving to Aunt Carol's permanently." Her voice was trembling like she knew it wasn't enough. My son's wife jumped in quickly. "We didn't mean anything bad. We were trying to fix the house." I looked around again. "Fix it," I said quietly. "By selling it?" No one answered. The stranger from the kitchen shifted, scratching his head, avoiding my eyes. The officer caught it. "And you are?" he asked. The man stammered. "I'm a real estate agent. They hired me to help with the listing." My son's face turned red. "It wasn't supposed to go this way," he muttered. That was it. The truth was out. They had cleaned out my savings, packed up my things, and were preparing to sell the house while I was still alive. My hands trembled, my vision blurred, but I didn't cry. Something inside me went completely still. I looked at my son, the same boy I once carried on my shoulders, the boy who used to fall asleep in my lap while I watched TV after work. I remembered the nights I came home from double shifts so he could have everything he needed. And now, here he stood, selling the roof I built, pretending it was just business. The officer stepped slightly between us, not because there was danger, but because he could feel the tension. "Mr. Peterson," he said softly, "we can sort this out. You still own this property. Nobody can take that from you without your consent." I nodded. My mouth was dry, my heart heavy. My daughter started sobbing now, covering her face. "We didn't mean to hurt you," she cried, but even that sounded empty. The words didn't reach me. They fell flat, like the air in that house had stopped carrying sound. The officer took a few steps toward the door and called in a second unit on his radio, asking for assistance. My son's wife turned cold. "Is this really necessary?" she snapped. The officer looked at her calmly. "Yes, ma'am. This man is the legal owner. Until everything is cleared, you can't stay here." Her mouth opened, but she had no answer. My son sat down, head in his hands, silent. The man from the kitchen quietly stepped back toward the hallway, trying to disappear. I just stood there, watching all of it. I didn't speak, because there was nothing left to say. Every word in my chest had already been betrayed. I thought about all the times I taught my son about honesty, respect, family, and how fast those lessons vanished once money entered the picture. The house I built with love had turned into a transaction. My name was still on the deed, but the heart behind it was gone. The officer handed the papers back to me, his voice steady. "You're going to be fine, sir. We'll make sure of it." I nodded again, still unable to look at anyone else. My family, my blood, couldn't even meet my eyes anymore. My daughter's sobs faded into quiet sniffles. My son's wife stood stiff, her jaw tight. The officer's radio crackled softly, breaking the silence again. That's when I realized something that made my chest ache even deeper. They weren't sorry because they hurt me. They were sorry because they got caught. The difference between guilt and regret was written all over their faces. And in that moment, the truth hit harder than anything I'd ever felt before. I hadn't lost my house. I'd lost my family. The room felt frozen. No one moved. No one breathed too loud. The officer stood tall, holding the folder in his hand, his face calm but firm. He turned slightly toward me and said in a quiet voice, "Mr. Peterson, do you still have the deed?" I nodded and pointed at my suitcase. He motioned for me to show it again, just to confirm. I opened the same brown folder, careful not to drop it. My hands were shaking, but I kept steady enough for him to read it. He took the paper, glanced down, then looked back up at my son and his wife. His tone changed, still calm, but sharper now. "This home is registered under Mr. Harold Peterson. That means he's the owner. Everything inside these walls belongs to him unless he decides otherwise." The words hit them like a hammer. My son's face went pale. My daughter-in-law looked at the floor, her arms crossed tight against her chest. My daughter was already crying silently, her shoulders trembling. I stood still, my heart beating slow but heavy. I didn't need to say a word anymore. The officer had said everything I couldn't. The stranger from the kitchen, the real estate agent, looked down at his shoes, mumbling something about not knowing the full situation. The officer glanced at him. "You're free to leave," he said flatly. The man nodded fast, grabbed his jacket, and walked out the door without saying goodbye to anyone. The sound of the door closing behind him felt final, like a chapter ending. The officer turned back to my family. "Here's what's going to happen," he said clearly. "You're going to leave the property for now until this situation is sorted legally. Mr. Peterson has the right to stay in his home," my son tried to argue. "Officer, please, this isn't what it looks like. We weren't stealing anything." The officer raised a hand. "Then you won't have a problem leaving peacefully." My son's wife muttered under her breath, something about me ruining everything. The officer gave her a look that shut her up quick. He wasn't rude, but his authority filled the room like a wall they couldn't cross. I stood beside him, watching the family I built come apart piece by piece. My daughter tried to say something again. "Dad, please, we didn't mean—" But she couldn't finish. The officer turned to me gently and said, "Sir, you can make decisions about pressing charges later if you wish. Right now, you just need to rest. You've had a shock." He placed the folder carefully on the small table beside me. The sound of the paper sliding against the wood made me realize something. After all these years, this single document was the only thing keeping my life from being taken away. Not family, not trust. A piece of paper. I looked around the room one more time. The laughter that filled this house just minutes before was gone. In its place was tension, regret, and fear. My son walked to the door, avoiding my eyes. My daughter followed, wiping her tears. My daughter-in-law stayed behind for a moment, whispering something angry under her breath, then finally stormed out. The officer stood quietly until the last one left. The door shut slowly, and the silence that followed was louder than any shouting could have been. He turned back to me. "You did the right thing keeping those papers safe," he said softly. I nodded, still not trusting my voice. He gave me a small, understanding look, not pity, just respect. "You're home now. Don't worry, nobody's taking this from you." Then he paused for a moment, scanning my face, and asked something that stayed with me forever. "Do you still want them to come back here, Mr. Peterson?" That question cut deep. It wasn't just about the house, it was about forgiveness. I didn't answer right away. I just looked around, seeing all the changes, the empty spaces where love used to live. Finally, I said, "No. Not right now." The officer nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. He picked up his radio and spoke quietly to confirm everything was under control. I stood there alone again, my hand resting on the table beside the deed. For the first time since walking through that door, I felt both broken and relieved. Broken because of what they'd done. Relieved because at least now, the truth was no longer hidden. The officer looked at me one last time before stepping outside. "Lock the door behind me, sir," he said. I nodded. The click of that lock felt like closing the past. The sound of the door closing behind the officer's last words stayed in my ears like an echo. I stood still in the middle of the living room, not moving, not even breathing heavy. The house was silent again. The same kind of silence that used to mean peace, but now only felt empty. My suitcase sat by my side, my cane leaning against the chair that wasn't mine anymore. I could still hear their car doors slamming outside, my family leaving in a rush, maybe scared, maybe ashamed. But I didn't go to the window. I didn't need to see them drive away. I just listened to the sound fade, like the end of a chapter I never asked for. For a few minutes, I didn't move. I kept my hand on the table, right next to the folder with my name on the deed. The officer's voice still replayed in my head. "You're home now." But what does home mean when everything inside it feels foreign? I looked around at the furniture, the decorations, the paint on the walls. Everything looked perfect, like a showroom, but it had no soul left in it. The warmth that used to fill this place was gone. The smell of my wife's favorite candles was gone. The sound of laughter that used to bring joy now only reminded me of betrayal. I took a deep breath and looked at the boxes again. Some of them had been sealed tight, ready to be moved or sold. My things, my memories, my life, priced and packed by the same people I raised. I bent down and touched one of the boxes labeled "Yard Sale." Inside were small things, my books, old trophies, my wife's garden gloves. I picked up the gloves and held them tight. They still had faint soil stains on the fingertips, the ones she never washed off completely. I could almost see her smile again for a second, the way she used to wave from the backyard when I came home from work. That memory hit me harder than the betrayal. It reminded me what real love felt like, and how far away that feeling had become. I walked slowly toward the fireplace. There was no photo of her anymore, no sign that this house ever belonged to both of us. I placed her gloves gently on the mantel and whispered under my breath, "We built this, didn't we?" My voice cracked, but no one was there to hear it. Maybe that was a good thing. Some words don't need witnesses. The officer had given me a choice: press charges or let things settle legally. But as I stood there, staring at the empty walls, I realized justice wasn't always about paperwork. Sometimes justice is simply walking away with your dignity when everyone else loses theirs. I could have called the officer back and told him I wanted them arrested for theft, for fraud, for whatever else they tried to do. I could have made it public, but I didn't. I was tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind that comes when you've been disappointed too many times. So, I made my decision. I went to the hallway closet, pulled out a small notepad, and wrote a few words on the first page. "House not for sale. Not today. Not ever." Then I taped that note to the front door, just in case they ever came back. Not for them to read, for me. To remind myself that some things are still mine. Not because of money, but because of memory. When I finished, I sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, resting my cane against my leg. My hand brushed over the new fabric, and I realized how much it didn't belong here. It was soft, but cold. That's how betrayal feels too. Soft at first, then cold forever. I looked toward the door one last time, and I knew I wasn't going to chase them, beg them, or forgive them too quickly. Sometimes you can't rebuild a home with people who burned it for comfort. That night, I slept in my bed again. Alone, but peaceful. For the first time in years, I didn't dream about family dinners or laughter. I dreamed about silence, but it was the quiet kind that doesn't hurt anymore. I had finally made my decision. I wasn't going to lose myself trying to keep people who had already let me go. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence didn't scare me. It just felt heavy. I sat on the couch, the new one they bought, staring at the walls that once carried pieces of my life. The officer had left hours ago. The sun was starting to go down, painting faint orange lines through the windows. Dust floated in the light, slow and peaceful, like time had finally stopped fighting me. I leaned back and listened to the old pipes hum inside the walls. For the first time in a long while, I realized how much I had missed the sound of my own house breathing. But the silence also had an ache in it. Every corner reminded me of what was gone. The photo frames were empty, the shelves bare. Even the air felt different, colder, cleaner, like it didn't remember me anymore. I walked through the hallway slowly, my cane tapping against the floor with each step. In my son's old room, the wallpaper was peeled halfway, as if they started changing it, but never finished. My daughter's childhood drawings that used to hang on the wall had been taken down. The only thing left was a small nail sticking out of the plaster, holding nothing. I moved from room to room, touching the walls as I passed. Each one carried a memory: birthdays, dinners, nights when the power went out and we laughed in candlelight. I could still hear faint echoes of laughter, the kind that used to fill this place before money and greed took over. I stopped by the kitchen doorway. The smell of food was gone, replaced by cleaning chemicals. I remembered mornings when my wife used to cook pancakes and the kids ran around stealing bites. That memory felt like another lifetime. When I reached the back door, I saw the garden through the glass. The weeds had grown high and the flowers were gone. The small wooden fence I built years ago was leaning, broken in one corner. I stepped outside slowly. The air was cool and sharp. I could smell rain in the distance. I sat down on the small step by the porch and looked around the yard. It was quiet, except for the wind. For a long time, I didn't think about what I lost. I thought about what I still had. The house was standing. The sky was still the same. My hands were still steady enough to open that folder and prove the truth. When night fell, I went back inside and turned on a single lamp. The yellow light filled the room just enough for me to see, but not enough to hide the emptiness. I picked up the officer's card from the table and placed it in the drawer under the phone. Then I sat in my chair, not my favorite one, just the one that was left, and let the quiet fill me. The ticking clock on the wall became the only sound. Tick, tick, tick. It was the sound of something old that still worked, even after everything else broke. I didn't feel anger anymore. The rage had burned out somewhere between the lies and the silence. What was left was something calmer, a kind of sadness that doesn't demand answers. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't about letting them back in. It was about not letting their choices ruin what was still mine. I had my roof, my walls, and the memories that built them. That was enough for now. Before going to bed, I walked to the front door one last time. I looked at the note I had taped there earlier. House not for sale. Not today. Not ever. The handwriting was shaky, but the message was strong. I smiled just a little and locked the door again. The sound of the bolt sliding into place gave me peace. The house was empty, but it was mine again. I turned off the light, walked down the hall, and went into my room. The bed creaked the same way it always had. I lay down slowly and stared at the ceiling. The silence didn't hurt anymore. It felt honest. After everything they took, this was what they left me with: quiet, space, and truth. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone inside it. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was scared or angry, but because I kept replaying every moment in my head. The laughter I heard when I opened the door. The silence that followed when they saw me. The way their faces changed when the officer stepped inside. It all felt like a bad dream, but the more I thought about it, the more I understood. It wasn't sudden. It didn't happen in one day. It was years of small changes, quiet distances, and forgotten phone calls that led to that moment. I had been losing my family slowly, piece by piece, long before I realized it. When the morning light came through the curtains, it touched the floor like nothing had happened. The world outside kept moving. Cars passed by, birds sang. The mailman walked past my gate. Life doesn't stop, even when everything inside you does. I got out of bed, made myself coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. It was quiet. No voices, no footsteps, no sound of anyone else breathing in the house. I stared at the steam rising from my cup and realized how peaceful it was. Lonely, yes, but peaceful. Sometimes those two things live in the same room. I walked to the living room again, looking around with new eyes. It didn't look as broken as it did last night. The boxes were still there, but I didn't rush to open them. The furniture they bought didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the house was mine again. The walls, the memories, the air. I thought about calling my sister Carol, telling her everything that happened, but I stopped myself. Not because I didn't want to talk, but because I didn't want sympathy. I wanted quiet strength. I wanted to feel what it's like to stand again after being betrayed by the people you loved most. Later that day, I found an old photo album buried inside one of the boxes, the same one my wife used to keep by the fireplace. I sat down and opened it slowly. The first picture was of her, smiling, holding our newborn son. Her eyes were bright, proud, full of love. I traced her face with my finger, the photo grainy from age. In that moment, I understood something simple but powerful. I hadn't failed as a father. I had done everything right. What went wrong was not my doing. People change. Greed grows in silence. And sometimes, the ones you die for are the same ones who stop seeing you as worth living for. The officer had been right when he said, "You're home now." But it took me a full day to understand what that meant. Home isn't about who fills the rooms. It's about what the walls remember. My house still carried the voice of my wife singing while cooking. It still had the dents on the doorframe from when my kids marked their height each year. Those memories couldn't be boxed up or sold. They belonged to me forever. That evening, as the sun began to set, I stood by the window and watched the light fade across the yard. The wind moved gently through the trees, brushing against the old fence. I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't even hate them. I just didn't recognize them. And maybe that was the saddest part. Realizing the people I raised had turned into strangers I wouldn't invite into my home now. Before I turned off the lights, I looked once more at the empty room where everything had started. I whispered quietly, "You tried to take my home, but all you did was show me who you are." My voice didn't shake. It was steady. The kind of steady that comes from surviving disappointment and still standing tall. I walked to the front door, turned the lock once more, and smiled just a little. I walked into my house and saw my family laughing. But when they saw the man standing behind me, the truth came out. The officer brought me home that day and took them out of it. Sometimes you don't lose your home. You just find out who never deserved to live in it. And that truth, no matter how painful, gave me something I thought I'd lost forever: peace.